Hello, everyone, and welcome to our August 2024 Peer Support Volunteer Training. My name is Michael Burke, and I'm the Director of Patient Programs at Concussion Legacy Foundation. Our training topic for today is child safeguarding guidelines, and specifically wanting to answer the question, what should peer support volunteers do if they know or suspect a child's safety is at risk? And our goal for today is really just to make sure we all understand that, yes, we're a team and we're trying to help people. This is a very serious topic. It's somewhat indirectly related to CLF's mission to help individuals with brain trauma. It's rare, but it does come up, thankfully, infrequently. But really what we want to just do is clarify team roles and what to do if we have concerns about child safety. So an overview of what we're going to talk about today includes first getting into the relevance of why are we talking about this and how does it relate to your role as a peer support volunteer. We'll get into some of the background and policies that we have in place. We'll talk about some of the peer support volunteer resources and materials you may have already seen. We'll get into what to know, what to do, what happens next after flagging a concern about child safeguarding. We'll add in some context and nuances, as well as addressing some frequently asked questions. In terms of relevance, we're going to start slightly wide and talk about CLF's position in the landscape of child safeguarding. And when we say it's a unique position, what we mean is CLF is not a typical mandated reporting institution, as you might think of a school or a hospital, for example. But we do interact with families and children, and this does present opportunities for CLF to act on harm reduction. And if you look at the CLF objective on the left side here as it relates to this topic, it's just a good summary where we say CLF occupies a unique position and follows guiding authorities to pursue consistent, good faith child safeguarding measures among varying institutional duty to report requirements. So there may be a few terms in there that you don't yet recognize. We'll get into them as the presentation goes along. But it's helpful to know that this objective and how we approach child safeguarding is informed by child safeguarding authorities, some guiding authorities that include the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Children's Bureau. You can see their logo over on the right, as well as the Canadian Child Welfare Research Portal and some associated legislation and resource gateways where guidelines and best practices are shared. Now getting in a bit more specifically about why this is relevant for peer support volunteers. Very similarly, peer support volunteers occupy a unique position. The focus of your role as a peer support volunteer for Concussion Legacy Foundation is on traumatic brain injury and on CTE. It's not necessarily on child safeguarding, but we do get the bigger picture when we are interacting with families and families that include children. Peer support volunteers, again, in the role as a peer support volunteer, are not formally mandated reporters, but do interact with families and do interact with children. And again, in those interactions with families and children, there may be opportunities to prevent harm. So while there are no in-person interactions with peer support partners, there are, of course, phone calls, video meetings, texts, and emails. And through those connections, you're forming really strong bonds with your partner. Those bonds can lead to really candid conversations about what a person is experiencing or a family is experiencing. It's also important to note that a peer support volunteer and a peer support partner enter that relationship with very different assumptions than a peer support partner going and speaking with a doctor, for example, or a teacher or a police officer. So there's different assumptions and different expectations when speaking with one of those professionals versus speaking with someone in the volunteer role for CLF. And then again, another unique piece of this is that you as peer support volunteers are kind of in it for the long haul. Many of these relationships have an expectation of a year of interaction, and that is enough time to hopefully see a lot of improvements in a person's recovery, for example, or in their ability to provide caregiving for a loved one. and over time you can see great progress. But the inverse of that is also true. Things do change over time, and developments can occur that are more negative. And this falls in that category of things that we would be more concerned about. And keeping kind of on the theme of relevance, but now expanding more so into what informs what we'll talk about next, and where does peer support volunteering fall within CLF's broader considerations about child safeguarding. We do want to point out that there are a few things at play before peer support connections are even considered. First is that all of the partners that come to the peer support connection program do come through the helpline first. And that is a program that has pretty robust screenings in place and responses and procedures where if a concern about child safeguarding was clear or came up in the CLF helpline interaction, it would be addressed before even downstream going to the peer support connection program. And in that process, any information that we gather would be shared with peer support volunteers before any kind of connection commitment is made, just to ensure you have the opportunity to decide whether or not the relationship is a good fit for you. More broadly, again, we also have an institution-wide child safeguarding policy. This is the source for the distilled policies for peer support volunteers, and it's our measures to ensure child safeguarding as a full organization. And then lastly, most broadly, is what's at play with regard to individual versus institutional duty to report or mandated reporting expectations. For institutions, this varies by location and organization type, as we already touched on. You know, a hospital has slightly different expectations than a Walmart, for example. Certain institutions have added responsibilities. Very similarly, individuals, some have added responsibilities based on profession, others don't. In some places, even those without added responsibilities tied to a profession have slightly more expectations about duty to report. And the average individual, you know, could be expected, if they suspect a child safeguarding concern, to make the proper authorities aware. I know this may sound like a lot of complexity and a lot of variation, but I do want to just boil it down and say that the volunteer expectations here are more limited in your role in your volunteering for CLF, and the policies that we have in place and the things that we talk about today have been shaped and crafted to take these variations and this complexity into account, just to ensure we're doing the right thing no matter where we are. This slide is just meant to be a reminder about what resources are available to you already as a peer support volunteer pertaining to child safeguarding. In the Peer Support Volunteer Training Guidebook, which you would have received during your onboarding and training process, we do have a section on reporting child abuse or neglect. We do also have our crisis response procedure, and by definition of crisis in that document, child safeguarding kind of falls into that situation. And all of this is updated and housed and linked on the Peer Support Volunteer Resource Hub. You can find that in the CLF menu by going to Resource Center, Peer Support, Become a Volunteer. If that changes, you can just enter into the search bar PSV Resource Hub to find the updates and frequently asked questions that we add on a rolling basis. And now, with all that said and in mind, we want to get into what to really know about child safeguarding. And a good place to start, again, we've touched on it, but just taking a moment to clarify, is what is a mandated reporter? And by definition here, it's any person, agency, organization, or entity that knows or in good faith suspects child abuse or neglect shall make a report. But this pertains specifically to teachers, doctors, nurses, counselors, and the associated institutions such as hospitals, schools, etc. It's most relevant. Mandated reporter is most relevant for those particular professions. It comes with added responsibilities than the average person or institution would have. And typically, you should already know if you're a mandated reporter. It's a very clear part of the certification and training process. Moving into maybe the most obvious question here is, what is child abuse or neglect, or what does it look like? And prefacing this section by just noting that, in rare circumstances, a peer support volunteer may recognize the signs of child abuse or neglect when interacting with a partner. With your partner, it may come up. Knowing what to look for is the crucial first step. And again, definitions and reporting guidelines can vary, but knowing or in good faith suspecting child abuse or neglect is enough to take next steps with CLF at least. And so as we get into these specific definitions here, we have the United States on the left from the CAPTA Act, which is one of the guiding authorities that we shared earlier. And we have on the right, the Canadian Child Welfare Research Portal. Looking for the United States, we can see any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caregiver that results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act that presents an imminent risk of serious harm. And moving further into Canada, acts of commission or omission by a parent or other caregiver that result in harm, potential for harm, or threat of harm to a child. The 5 primary forms of maltreatment are physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional maltreatment, and exposure to domestic violence. All of the things listed here, while not in minute detail, are fairly obvious and recognizable by a reasonable individual. And we'll proceed with these definitions and keep them in mind as we talk about further things to know and what to do. So as a last anticipation, and a last good thing to know is when this might come up. When could this become evident? So as a first example, your partner may discuss child abuse or neglect directly. They could say in no uncertain terms that it's occurring. Someone that they are responsible for, their child or someone in their life that they're a caregiver to is in danger, or there is a threat to them. That's a really direct address of child safeguarding. Other times a conversation, text messages, phone call, it may allude to events that include clear risk factors that you may be able to deduce are leading to or could result in child endangerment, abuse, or neglect. And then lastly, without the direct address or alluding to it by your partner, you as a volunteer may be in a situation where you could see or hear or interpret the signs that could be visible during something like a video meeting, for example. And without going into great detail, I think you'll know what I mean, but a hand raising up to strike a child, or something that you hear in the background, all times when this may come up and may warrant action of some kind. So that raises the question, if you've recognized it, what should you do? And here we'll focus on the 5 R's in terms of best practices when it comes to flagging concerns. That is, recognize, which we've discussed, respond appropriately, which we're about to discuss, refer to proper authorities and resources, record the details, and then review the situation, conduct an overview and a post-action assessment. Here we've marked your role as a peer support volunteer with an asterisk. Please do, recognize and respond appropriately, and know that the additional pieces of the 5 R's do not fall on your plate. And for a clear definition of, what does it mean to respond appropriately if you've recognized a concern about child safeguarding, that's mostly when and how to notify CLF. So in terms of when, please do so as soon as you can, safely notify CLF. How is very simple. It's just an email to support@concussionfoundation.org with the details of your concerns. And then for clarification, it's a peer support volunteer's responsibility to act if you recognize cause for concern about a child or the behavior of an adult toward a child, but it's not a peer support volunteer's responsibility to determine if abuse has occurred or what action is required to protect them. So now we get on to what happens next. If you have flagged a concern, what does it look like from there? Well, after a peer support volunteer has responded appropriately by notifying CLF, we'll assess that information, we'll assume responsibility for escalation, documentation, and follow-up, and in essence, we take it from there. We will let you know if more information is needed, if we need a phone call with you or a meeting. But typically, you'll be able to maintain normal communication with your partner. You are not expected or required to notify your partner after sharing a concern with CLF. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in another slide. Um, CLF will discuss with you why a concern was or was not escalated to proper authorities. And here, proper authorities is defined as the child protection agency in whichever state or province the suspected abuse took place. And then if CLF believes your partner should be notified when a concern is escalated, we'll lead that communication. We'll talk with you before it happens, but do want to just note that not every situation would be appropriate to notify the partner about an escalation to proper authorities. And an exception to this broad, 6-point what happens next overview would be that in a different situation for immediate, imminent, life-threatening situations, much more akin to what we have in our crisis response document where, a life is in danger right now. We do have a much faster timeline and a potentially more intensive intervention. So again, it may look like that really fast movement for a crisis. But we always act quickly about these concerns, but some of these pieces may just be condensed and expedited depending on the severity of the situation. Now that we know all of that, we know the context, we know the relevant, we know what's important to understand, we know what to do and what happens next if one of these concerns comes up. We can add some context and nuances. And again, just as a reminder, the decision about escalating or informing a decision to report to proper authorities does not fall to a peer support volunteer. CLF takes on that responsibility, but we do want to share, just for transparency, how that decision is made or what considerations go into it. These are based on best practice guidelines from guiding authorities and organizations that provide recommendations for how to handle this for the type of organization that CLF is. And here we're considering things like the presence of unambiguous harm or life-threatening circumstances. If that's present, that decision it can be quite clear. We also consider whether clarity is possible given the settings, circumstances, or interpretations of the information that we have available as a peer support volunteer or as CLF working with a peer support volunteer. Really, we're looking here for possible misinterpretation on our part, on the part of what happened. We always gather as much information as possible and try and make the best decision making going forward. And then finally, we'll consider, is there good faith anticipation of harm reduction if a report would be made or an investigation were opened into the circumstances? For example, here, just as a potential mitigating circumstance, and depending on the location, there are some places that have passed certain laws to add certain context and nuances. But for example, a child who is exposed to domestic violence, not as the direct victim of domestic violence, but around and in the presence of domestic violence. In a situation like that, where there is a clear protective effort or efforts being made to protect the child by a caregiver or by the peer support partner that you're talking with, really careful thought is going to go into the good faith anticipation of harm reduction, whether or not making a report and initiating an investigation would be, given the circumstances, in the best interest of the child and be most likely to lead to a harm reduction in that situation. Sometimes referring to support or increasing our vigilance of a circumstance is the best option, particularly making sure that an individual knows where to go and what support they can get if a situation takes a turn. But other times it's quite clear and action is quite obviously necessary. But with that context and nuance, I think we can get into some of the frequently asked questions from other situations that we've encountered, or some questions that we anticipate might be relevant as you consider child safeguarding and your role as a peer support volunteer. Starting with, what if the suspected abuse happened a long time ago? Here we can just boil it down to saying it's okay to flag it if it comes up and you're not sure. Someone may mention that it happened decades ago. If you're not sure, you can flag that for us. But really the priority is identifying and recognizing imminent harm, current harm, near-term possible harm. Always okay to flag it, but if something happened a decade ago and the perpetrator is no longer in the picture, it's a slightly different circumstance, but it's always okay to flag that with our team. Another question here being, do all flag concerns lead to a formal report? The answer here is no. Most concerns are flagged just to play it safe and are considered very carefully, but really the goal is to A, not miss any opportunity to intervene for harm reduction, but B, also to make sure that no peer support volunteer is left alone with one of these concerns. Getting into a third question, should I tell my partner I've been instructed to share concerns with CLF? Another way to think about this is, does my partner know that this dynamic is at play? And so to answer that question, first, know that CLF does address duty to report during the onboarding process for partners. In our sections on privacy of the onboarding agreement and the key policies compilation, we do get into situations where privacy and confidentiality have exceptions. But in general, it may be good practice to remind your partner when you're starting a new connection that this dynamic is at play, that you do occupy a unique situation where in certain circumstances, you may need to flag a concern in order to protect a child. But that's not necessary in all new relationships. If you feel it's clearly relevant, young children are in the picture or part of the conversation, maybe a good idea, but don't stress too much about this piece of it. This question is a bit more downstream, but related to that topic. Should I tell my partner after I've shared concerns with CLF? So starting with our answer on this one, first, we just want to say that if a partner is the suspected perpetrator, please definitely wait to speak with CLF. In that situation, it may be best to proceed without informing the partner about a flag or an escalation. You can know that no matter the situation, there is not a requirement or an obligation for you to talk about this with your partner. In fact, generally, if a concern is flagged to CLF about child abuse or neglect, and it's not escalated further to proper authorities for the reasons discussed previously, we're generally not going to go back to the partner and say, hey, this internal review happened. By extension, there's no obligation or expectation that you as a volunteer would bring it up out of nowhere or discuss it with your volunteer. We can always talk about that if you do want to do so. You may find it's important or relevant. A bit further down the line here, in a situation where CLF escalates this concern to a proper authority and an investigation is open, there are certain situations where it may be appropriate to inform the partner about it. In other situations, it may not be. In either way, CLF is leading communication on this. We will be talking about it with you first. We'll get into what the best approach is, whether or not you will be talking about it with your partner. We understand it, by deduction, your partner may realize that you were the person to have shared a concern. And we will take all of the nuance and the variables into account as we talk about the situation with you. But again, while there's no expectation or obligation, based on your judgment, you are free to decide if you think it's something to preserve trust or you think it's something that can be done without further unintended harm in either circumstance where something's been escalated or not. You can choose to talk about that with your partner. And as always, you can talk about it with us before doing so, just to brainstorm the best approach. So on to another question here. How often are concerns flagged or escalated? This is another way to say perhaps how concerned should I be as a peer support volunteer about this? It is very rare. We've had very few escalations. We've had more concerns that are flagged and evaluated, but very few escalations. And that includes the helpline, it includes peer support, and includes other CLF peer support programs. Thankfully, it's infrequent. With that in mind, the next question here, understanding how rare it is, it does kind of raise the question, why does CLF prioritize sharing this information? If it's so rare, why talk about it? Well, yes, it's rare that flag concerns warrant formal reporting. Rarer that formal reports lead to an investigation by proper authorities. But overall, the goal is to just prevent missed opportunities for harm reduction and prevent, a missed chance to remove a child from a dangerous situation. On to question 7. Do I have any individual legal obligations or liabilities? And this is outside of your role as a peer support volunteer. We have talked about this in our previous slides already, but just in summary, individual responsibilities as an average person, it does vary by location or profession, but in places where every individual does have a duty to report, that duty is meant to encourage good faith measures and action. It's not meant to be a punitive statement of liability or holding someone to punitive measures. It's just meant to expand the safety net. You should already know if you are a mandated reporter based on your profession with added responsibilities, but as always, if you're not sure, you can ask and you can talk to us. And finally, if you have any general questions or concerns, you can email support@concussionfoundation.org or schedule a time to meet with our team. I know I gave a summary of these frequently asked questions, but we do have a handout and a document with these questions and our responses in writing, if you'd like to refer to them at a later date, and that will be part of the recap and eventually added to the Peer Support Volunteer Resource Hub. But just in summation, thank you for watching this training and being part of the Peer Support Connection program. We would not be able to do this program without peer support volunteers. If you have any questions, please reach out to support@concussionfoundation.org. And we look forward to seeing you soon in one of our peer support volunteer meetings or interacting with you as we connect you with a partner. Thank you.